kaydederek videolarını yollamış olan, katkıda bulunan sevgili dostlarımıza geçmek istiyoruz. İlk konuşmacımız Mikhail Löwy olacak. Mikhail Löwy Türkiye'de az çok biliyoruz. Çok sayıda çalışması yayınlandı. Yani Marx'tan Walter Benjamin'e, ekososyalizmden gerçeküstücülüğe, Marx'ın ve din ilişkisine kadar çok sayıda çalışması, makalesi Türkçe'de de bulunabiliyor. Şimdi Mikhail Löwy'yi dinliyoruz.
Well, let us say a few words about Geschichte und Klassenbewusstsein, History and Class Consciousness, published 100 years ago by Genç Lukacs. Well, just few words on how Lukacs arrived at this work in 1923. Yeah? Lukacs started in being mainly interested in cultural and literary issues, but he developed during these early years, from 1914 to 1918, let's say, a kind of a romantic anti-capitalist critique of capitalism. This is very clear in his early writings. He is critical of capitalism, but from a romantic perspective related to pre-capitalist values. And this is even apparent in his first Marxist or communist writings, like Ancient and New Culture. When he says that capitalism destroyed culture, which existed in pre-capitalist times, and socialism will bring about a new culture. So, and this anti-capitalist element is still present in Geschichte und Klassenbewusstsein, but in a much less obvious way. Now, history and class consciousness is a unique piece. There's no other work in Marxist philosophy who had such a deep and lasting influence. Not well beyond the borders of Central Europe or the 1920s. It became a decisive reference for a vast amount of thinkers, very different between them, such as Ernst Bloch, Karl Mannheim, the whole Frankfurt School, Theodor Adorno, Walter Benjamin, Herbert Marcuse, but also Maurice existentialists such as Maurice Merleau-Ponty, Jean-Paul Sartre, and other Marxists like Henri Lefebvre, Lucien Goldman, Karel Kosik in Czechoslovakia, Adolfo Sanchez Vasquez in Mexico, and my friend Roberto Schwartz in Brazil, among others. Among others. And it is a book that is still avidly being read, studied, and discussed and criticized today, 100 years after its publication. And it is indeed a remarkable piece because it is a synthesis, a dialectical synthesis, an Aufhebung, between ethics and politics, subject and object, future and present, between the final goal and the immediate circumstances. Let us recall just 2 or 3 main points of Geschichte und Klassenbewusstsein. First, the dialectical category of totality. That's very important. There is one phrase where Lukács writes, what is orthodox Marxism? And he says, what distinguishes Marxist method from bourgeois science is not the predominance of economic factors. It is a dialectical category of totality. And this is very, very important. So this opens a new way of understanding Marxism, completely different from the vulgar Marxism of the Second International and of so many others. And the second very important point is, of course, a critique of reification, how capitalism transforms everything into a thing, a commodity, including human relations, law, the state, culture. Everything becomes a commodity, becomes a thing. Yeah? So this is very important contribution, of course, based on Marx, etc., but it's a new interpretation. And the third is what he says about the consciousness of the proletariat, that the proletariat class is the only one who, achieving the highest degree of consciousness, zugerechnetes Bewusstsein, he is able to have an understanding of the totality of the historical process, the dialectics of the historical process in its totality. No other class can achieve this. Yeah? Also, this is a very important contribution, among others. Yeah, many other things, but I'm just referring to the three. One, because I think they were really decisive, and they are some of the elements which make that history and class consciousness was a turning point in the history of Marxist thinking in the 20th century. A turning point, a break with the dominant Marxism of the time, which was the Marxism of the Second International, and to some extent also of the Third International, people like Zinoviev, Bukharin, and the others. So it was really starting something new, which will become, call it Western Marxism or call it dialectical Marxism, as you wish, throughout the 20th century. Yeah? Of course, one of the interesting things in history and class consciousness was that he was able to integrate the contribution of the German social sciences. While rejecting the bourgeois limitations, he was able to integrate some aspects of their thinking. People like Georg Simmel, and Tönnies, and particularly Max Weber. And the young Lukács knew personally Max Weber. They were friends. He took part in the seminar which Weber organized at his home in years 1912 to 14. And they still remain in contact. And one clearly see several elements which were taken from Weber in Geschichte und Klassenbewusstsein. This is why Maurice Merleau-Ponty says that Lukács is a Weberian Marxist. But this should not be interpreted as a kind of eclectic combination, because Lukács is basically a Marxist thinker. Yeah? But he was able to integrate some elements from Weber in his thinking. For instance, the concept of reification, you can find some aspects of Weber's more critical remarks about the purely quantitative and sachlich, reified nature of capitalism. And also the connection between Protestantism and capitalism. For Lukács in Weber, he quotes Weber, is a good example of reification. Yeah? It means that for the Protestant believer, there is no way to control his economic activity. It depends on something completely unpredictable like divine providence, but divine providence just a way of giving form to the reification. Yeah? Now, and also from the methodological perspective, concepts like consciousness of the proletariat, they have something to do with an ideal type in the Weberian sense. Yeah? Lukács says you don't find the true class consciousness, zugerechnetes Bewusstsein, empirically. Yeah? It's an ideal type, it's a construction. Yeah? And it's an objective possibility. It is also a Weberian category. Yeah? So you can say that some important elements in Weber are, in Lukács, sorry, are borrowed from Weber. Of course, he rejects Weber bourgeois approach and his non-dialectical method, and of course they are wide apart politically and philosophically, but at the same time, Lukács was able to take from Weber some insights which are important and bring them into his reflection in history and class consciousness. Huh? So now a few words about how Lukács reacted to the criticism which was launched against him. Yeah. Now, immediately after the book was published, a few months or 1 year later, he was the object of several critical comments from social democrats on one side and from communists on the other. He didn't pay attention to the social democrats, but he decided to answer to the communist critics. And he did this in a paper, very important paper called Schwostismus und Dialektik, which is a kind of philosophical political continuation of history and class consciousness. It's a text which Lukács didn't publish and was discovered a few years ago and published, and so now we can take knowledge of it. And I think it's very important because it shows that at least during the first years, Lukács didn't give up his views, its political and his philosophical. And this document, Schwostismus und Dialektik, it's an answer to Abraham de Borin and Laszlo Ruders, a Russian and a Hungarian communist philosophers, who criticized history and class consciousness as being purely idealist and subjectivist, while Marxism is a science of the objective course of history. Yeah? So Lukács reacts against this as a positivist, vulgar, materialist approach, which has nothing to do with the spirit, revolutionary spirit of Marxist dialectics. And you oppose this a revolutionary dialectical perspective where the subjective movement is very important. Yeah? The subjective moment being class consciousness, organization, political initiative, vanguard party, etc., etc. This is so. He says, in the moment of crisis and revolution, the Augenblick, yeah, the subjective element is the decisive. Yeah? It's not the objective movement of the economy that decides. No, it's the subjective moment which is decisive. Yeah? So it is. So this is a passionate dialectic defense of history and class consciousness from the perspective of a, let's say, dialectical view of the revolutionary process and the importance of the subjective moment. And he rejects the views of his critics, De Borin and Ruder, as being a form of positivism, pseudo-scientific view, and as being a form of Schwostismus. This is a curious expression, meaning from the Russian Schwost, which means the queue, Schwanz in German. So these people, instead of being the vanguard of the historical process, they are at the queue. They wait for things to happen and then they join the movement. This is what they are proposing the Communist Party to do. And Lukács used this term, from which appears in Lenin, in What is to be Done of Lenin, to criticize their approach. that the Marxists should follow the objective course of history instead of being in the vanguard and intervening in the process through organization and revolutionary initiative. So this was written in 1925. In my view, it has no date, but I think it's 1925. Lukács tried to publish it, but could not. He couldn't find a journal. He tried to publish it in Russia, but it didn't work. And he soon gave it up. Why didn't he try to publish it later? Because I think he changed his views. He changed his views in 1926 in a piece called Moses Hess and the Utopian Idealism or something like that, where he criticized Moses Hess, but beyond Moses Hess, he criticized all kinds of utopian and subjective views of socialism and opposing to this the objective realism of Hegel. Yeah? So there is a philosophical change, which is also a political one, because it means his acceptance of socialism in one country of Stalin. Yeah? Now, Lukács, a few years later, not immediately, a few years later, he will start a series of self-criticisms of Geschichte und Klassenbewusstsein. The first one which I found in 1934, which is a terrible critique. He said this book is purely idealistic and therefore dangerous because idealism leads immediately to fascism. Yeah, something quite absurd. Yeah? And he will develop several such criticisms, and he will forbid the book to be published. Yeah? It wasn't republished for dozens of years. Yeah? Couldn't find it. So only in the 60s he accepted that it be published again and translated, but insisted to publish an introduction where he explains what is wrong in the book. Yeah? And I think these criticisms are not really very relevant. I think the book is really still today a very important starting point to think about history, class consciousness, revolutionary politics, the dialectical method, capitalist reification. It is still very, very much relevant. Of course, the political situation is not the same of 1923, yeah? But the basic theoretical, philosophical, methodological elements are still very much relevant. Yes, very much relevant. So I think history and class consciousness 100 years later is still a very good starting point to think about capitalism and about the revolutionary alternative to